and I'm glad there's such a constituency here excited about politics and policy here in Massachusetts. We got kind of a big election happening in a couple weeks, and I think a lot of people are just curious about what the state of play is for crypto and how we're going to learn about what's going to happen with the election and what to expect. So we'll just do a quick intro down the line and dig into the state of play today and what we can expect the next few weeks. My name is Amira. I'm the head of policy at the Solana Foundation, and I just live about a 15-minute walk away, so excited to see this happening in my neighborhood. We all just want to take a quick 20, 30 seconds about who we are and sort of our experience in crypto policy and law.
Yeah, nice to meet you, everyone. My name is Mari. I'm in-house counsel at a stealth mode crypto company, and I teach at Boston College Law School, training future lawyers so that we can have compliant projects served by well-trained attorneys in the future. I've spent the last 7 years working with crypto companies as an outside counsel and now in-house counsel.
Hey everyone, my name is Mark Cianci. I am a crypto litigator and a broad business and securities litigator in the space. I've been in the blockchain ecosystem for around the last 4 years. I am partner at a boutique law firm, Israel David, with offices here in Boston and in New York.
Hey everybody, I'm Gus Coldebella. I'm a partner at True Ventures. And a little homework, don't get up, but text all your friends who are in there, tell them to come back in. My history with crypto started in probably about 2017 when I was a partner at a firm called Goodwin Procter here in Boston, and started getting a lot of questions about crypto and found it fascinating. And then I became the chief legal officer at Circle, which is the issuer of the USDC coin, and it's been going like crazy from there. I spent a lot of time in Washington, D.C. talking to the elected officials that I was talking to John Deaton with about, before about just how transformative this technology can be.
Awesome. Well, thank you all for being here today. So why don't we start grounding ourselves with what the current state of play is in crypto policy. So, you might know there's 3 branches of government. There's Congress, there's the executive branch, and then there's the judiciary. And to date, we've seen most of the action happening let's say, in Congress, a little bit the executive branch, and a little bit what's going on in the judiciary. So why don't we start with the current state of play of what's happening with crypto legislation. Gus, you want to give us the rundown?
Sure. I mean, zooming out, it's important to think about, actually, John mentioned this earlier, the state of play in technology in general is Congress should let the founders and the devs cook, right? It's like, let's come up with great technology that delights people, that changes the world. So why are we on a crypto panel saying, well, we need Congress to do something? And the reason we need Congress to do something is because the law has essentially let the SEC say, I'm looking around and I see an investment contract, and that investment contract is a security. And if it's a security, it needs to be regulated and registered, and you didn't register it, right? So the current law allows the SEC to reach out, we think, beyond its mandate and say, okay, that's a security, you got to stop doing it. The only solution for us, since the executive branch is doing that, is with the other 2 branches of government that Amira mentioned. One is Congress saying, no, SEC, your authority does not reach to all of these tokens, number 1. And if Congress doesn't act, which it has not yet, we have to bring lawsuits and have judges say, wait a minute, I know, SEC, how you're reading the Howey test and how you think that digital assets are all securities. They are not. So the trajectory of what has been going on here has been really a multi-front battle. When I started at Circle, it was talking to the SEC about how they should do rulemaking that makes it very clear that tokens can be used for useful purposes. They can be traded. They are not securities. Or if there was a need to have them all be registered, that they could be registered in a way that, that allowed all of the important innovations of crypto to continue to happen. The SEC took a very, very different tack, and that's what left the industry where we are right now.
I think that's great grounding. And I think what you're starting to see happen in Congress is an increasing movement towards a couple of sort of, I'd say, categories of legislation. So one has to do with what we call market structure, which you might hear. And this is basically tackling the issue that Gus talked about, which is how do we think about the categorization of tokens as commodities, securities, something else. And that's, we had major market structure legislation pass out of the House. There are two chambers of Congress, right? So it passed out of the House earlier this year on a bipartisan basis. And this was the biggest piece of crypto legislation to ever pass Congress. So that was a huge step forward, but it hadn't made it to the Senate. And then there's another suite of legislation that people are considering called stablecoin legislation, which is what it sounds like, right? It's legislation that governs who can issue a stablecoin and what the requirements there are. And there we've seen a little bit of movement in the House, but we haven't seen legislation get as far as stablecoin legislation. So those are the two sort of suites of legislation that when people say Congress needs to act, most people are referring to. Now there's a bunch of other stuff out there. There's stuff related to CBDCs, or as Mr. Deaton pointed to, things related to anti-money laundering, but really it's like stablecoin and market structure. So that's sort of what we see happening from the legislature. And I think a lot of people are interested in what is happening in this sort of like tete-a-tete between the executive branch and the judiciary. And that's something that we like to call like there's an intersection of litigation and enforcement actions and like a bunch of stuff happening there. So Mark, maybe you can give us the rundown of what some of the biggest cases or like the most prominent state of play there is.
Yeah, in that sphere, one of the main issues that's being litigated is the exact issue that Gus previewed, which is the characterization or not of a crypto asset transaction as a securities transaction. And over the past 2 years, but especially intensifying earlier this year, there have been a slew of either court decisions or new litigations kicked off that are starting to crystallize answers in that area. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your perspective, the courts are not unified in how they're treating that question. So, for example, last year, as many of us will be familiar with, in the Ripple case that candidate Deaton was involved in, last year the judge concluded that secondary sales in the XRP token, in the sense that someone who purchased from the issuer is then selling to someone further downstream, would not be characterized as securities transactions. That decision was appealed just earlier this week. There's actually some hullabaloo about whether the SEC missed its deadline to appeal that question, but we will see that now play out at the appellate court level. Now, and that same court, so that was issued by the court in the Southern District of New York, a different judge just a few days later in the Terraform case concluded that secondary sales of digital assets tokens could be characterized and would be characterized as securities. And that case earlier this year resulted in a $4 billion judgment against Terraform Labs and its founder. Then fast forwarding to cases that have been initiated more recently and where decisions came out earlier this year, you have cases by the SEC against Coinbase, cases by the SEC against Kraken, as well as Binance. And then just last week, Crypto.com decided to sue the SEC after having received a Wells notice in which the SEC indicated its intent to take action against Crypto.com for allegedly operating as an unauthorized securities broker. So those 4 cases will all play out in parallel. So far, none of them have concluded. They're all initiated in different districts across the country, and we are going to need to watch all 4 of them to discern where the landscape may lead over the coming months and years.
Mari, when are we going to figure out what the actual answers are and why the heck does it take so long?
It's a mess, right? Like all these litigations and courts finding different opinions with kind of similar facts, like all secondary market transactions, securities or not. So, as Gus mentioned, Congress acting might be one option where we would have some clear guidelines on what these tokens are. First sales from the issuer when investors are buying millions of tokens could be possibly regulated by the SEC as securities. But then if retail investors are buying 2 tokens to actually use the platform, maybe that would be commodities and CFTC. So you might think, well, is that any clearer? Like we have a bunch of regulators coming into play, SEC, CFTC, Consumer Protection Agency, FTC has not been that active. but some argue that they should take more active role because some of these misrepresentations are really consumer protection questions. Then we have FinCEN and OFAC, and I think we should actually talk more about that because those questions are not anymore fines and slap on the wrist, but those are actually very, very serious things.
What are FinCEN and OFAC?
Yeah, so those are like, are we dealing with sanctioned parties? OFAC keeps a list of sanctioned wallet addresses. So if your protocol is something where people can, for example, exchange tokens or create liquidity pools, do you have technological restrictions so that sanctioned wallets cannot access your platform? Like that's doable from a tech perspective, but do folks know that that's very, very important because the founders have strict liability, meaning it's not a defense that you didn't know that the rules existed. And you actually have some experience with FinCEN, right?
Unfortunately, yes. No, I mean, I think the point that Mari is making is super important. All of the light and heat in crypto regulatory efforts have been aimed at the SEC because the SEC has been the big dog in the junkyard, but the authority and the agency with the ability that if it goes the wrong way to really disrupt what we find to be super special about crypto, which is its disintermediated nature, its permissionless nature, that's FinCEN. That's the various agencies that live within the Department of the Treasury, and I'm going to tell you why. It's because, long ago, decades ago, the government passed something called the Bank Secrecy Act, which requires banks to essentially KYC their customers and report on suspicious transactions, among a long list of other things. But if you're dealing with a bank or another financial services provider like Coinbase, they're gonna take down your name and your address and your social and make sure that you are who you say you are. Now, what did Satoshi's paper do? It created a network and then hundreds of networks that allow people to participate without knowing counterparties and permissionlessly in blockchain networks. But there are characters within the ecosystems that blockchains create, like validators or node operators or other parties that are incentivized to all do the right thing under the rules of the blockchain, that Elizabeth Warren and others in the Senate like her, and some people within the Department of Treasury want to say, you, validator, have the same obligations as a bank or Coinbase. You cannot facilitate or bundle or publish to a block this transaction or set of transactions unless you know the name and address and social security number of the person who is affecting the transaction. That, I think, everyone in the room knows will absolutely break the systems that that have been invented and are causing so much innovation in this space.
It's a great breakdown. So let's get into the juicy stuff, which is what's going to happen with this election. So I won't ask people to make predictions about who will win yet, but I think it's important to delve into questions around what are the implications of whoever is going to win. So why don't we talk a little bit, and we'll start first with a Trump administration. So let's say Donald Trump wins the presidency again. He's getting inaugurated in January 2025. That means we're off to the races with crypto. Is that right?
Well, yeah, sorry, but yeah. Did you watch the speech where he read on teleprompter saying, I will fire Gary Gensler, and then the audience erupted, yeah! And he was like, wait, who is this guy? Like, who did I just fire? So if that happens, it creates a question, will the SEC continue this enforcement route that they've been now playing for the last 5 years? The head of enforcement left the SEC earlier this month. If Chancellor also leaves, there will be a lot of room at the top to figure out what will be the future crypto policy. And there's something we can do, but not so much to actually elect folks. But what we can do is to have a plan. If somebody who is crypto-friendly is elected there, they will ask, so, okay, guys, what do you want? You've been complaining for 5 years. Tell us what you want. Is it this SEC/CFTC regulatory structure where we have 2 regulators? Is it something where Consumer Bureau would have more active role? What do we want? if they ask, what do we want?
Yeah, just to jump off that, I agree that if Trump is elected, it will be largely off to the races for crypto. I was actually in the room when he made that prediction around Chairman Gensler, but I think it's also important to shift the focus beyond just the SEC, because a lot of times we want to fixate there, but the president also has the authority to appoint the chairs of all the other regulatory agencies, and certainly within the Department of Justice, which is where the criminal sanctions and criminal enforcement exist. The president has authority not only to appoint the attorney general for the entire country, but the lead attorney for enforcement of the federal laws within each state. And we've seen, especially within the Department of Justice's enforcement of Treasury laws, Bank Secrecy Act laws, a very wide-ranging perception of their own authority, including to go after developers of protocols that just create software and upload it and allow others to use it. Those developers, those programmers, those leaders in the space in terms of providing functionality for usage of crypto tokens have been targeted criminally by the Department of Justice, including the developer of Bitcoin Fog, the developers of Tornado Cash, and they have had wide-ranging outcomes that are heavily problematic for other developers that have emerged from those prosecutions. So I think the president's ability to guide the law enforcement angle in a more sensitized way that doesn't hurt further development will be one of the potential implications from a Trump presidency.
Gus, what do you think?
Well, you know, it's beyond me to predict anything that Donald Trump will do if he's reelected to the presidency, but I will tell you what I think is important. I think the speech that Mari was referring to kicked off, it was a catalyst to a lot of discussions within the Biden administration and then in the Harris campaign about crypto. What do I mean? I mean, I think the people in the Biden administration who are focused on securities regulation and financial issues, like, hey, crypto, it's a little issue. We know how we feel about it, and we don't feel very good about it. Trump mentions crypto in that speech, and the political people in the Biden White House say, wait a minute, this could actually be an election issue. And not only is it an election issue, it's an election issue with the people who we're really targeting, who are the young in this country, the young people who are, they don't have time for banks. They're very interested in crypto, and look how many of them there are in the swing state. So while I don't know what Trump's going to do, the first rule that, that did or purported to do, it was never passed, that regulating intermediaries, it was actually issued in the first Trump administration. So it's hard for me to say it's going to be materially better, but what is materially better is that crypto went from an issue that, you know, the political people could legitimately ignore to one that's really front and center in the policy development of both of these campaigns. So no matter who is elected, I think the crypto folks who are paying attention here and getting them to say these things on the campaign trail will hold their feet to the fire when one of them is in office.
I think that's a great assessment. It's also a great dodge of the question, but I think it's great that you dug into it. I'll say I'm not so convinced that the person who wins the presidency sort of is the predicate for whether or not crypto is, quote unquote, off to the races. And I'll say that's because there's a really important other set of elections happening, which is for who's going to control the Senate and who's going to control the House. And all these three things have a major interplay with each other. So, you know, I think what Gus said is right, which is what we saw actually in the last Trump administration were some rules that were not beneficial to crypto. But what has changed in the past, 4 years has been the political tenacity of of folks like you, right? Like of people in crypto grassroots who have really shown their energy around the issue. But what we see, you know, there's multiple things that are pretty important to the outcome of the election. And we're going to see, okay, who's going to control the Senate, who's going to control the House, and that's really going to dictate what kind of crypto legislation we see, or if we see crypto legislation. So as things stand right now, it's a pretty sure bet that the Republicans will win the Senate. Not entirely sure, but like it's pretty close that way. And then the House is a bit more, harder to tell. It's edging slightly towards Democrats, but it's like a toss-up, basically, right? And so that's going to tell us, okay, who's going to put forward legislation and what's the interplay between the House and the Senate going to be. So you can imagine that if the Republicans control both the House and the Senate, it might be easier to put forward a bill than if there's a split chamber. But I don't actually know if that's true. I think that's probably pretty true. I'll also say that I think if Democrats win the House again, the people who are going to be the chairs of the committee that works on crypto legislation have indicated that they're pretty interested in seeing crypto legislation because they've seen what grassroots support the industry has. So I don't think it's as clear cut as Trump wins, we're off to the races, or Harris wins, we're restrained. I think it's much more complex, but I think what's true is sort of the political gravitas of the space has really picked up and people are paying attention to crypto in a way that they weren't before. So I'll reverse my question now, which is, what do each of us think happens in a Harris administration? Now that I've caveated it like crazy, like I'm curious where each of you ends up on what we think we'll see out of that administration.
I'll go first. So one thing that Vice President Harris has made very clear is she is not trying to just be the continuation of the Biden administration. And one particular instance of that was a comment made within the past few weeks, either by herself or by her campaign, that if she is elected, there's no foregone conclusion at the SEC level that Chairman Gensler would remain as the chair, and there may be a reinstallation of power there. I think that's somewhat emblematic of the Harris current campaign, and if elected, it would be administration's mentality around trying to create a divergence between the Biden administration and the potential Harris administration, and I think we may see that roll out. I don't think it would be nearly as all-encompassing as a Trump victory would imply, in the sense that I think, for example, the head of law enforcement, federal law enforcement for each of the states, those U.S. attorneys, I don't think they would be cast aside. It would be heavily politically unorthodox to do so, but perhaps in certain more customized scenarios, such as the chair of the SEC, there could be a moderation in the level of enforcement.
So sounds like crypto will have a great year no matter what happens.
Gus?
You know, just riffing a little bit, I don't know where this is going to end up. But
The election or the riff?
I think in a Harris administration, I think Mark said this earlier, every time we've heard the vice president speak, she's like, I'm not Joe Biden, right? And I think the interesting A/B test is, we've known for a while, or at least it's been sort of DC scuttlebutt, that Gary Gensler does not want the SEC chair to be his last job in the government. In fact, the job that he really covets is to be the Secretary of the Treasury. And a few minutes ago, we talked about how important the agencies within the Department of the Treasury are to crypto regulation, including FinCEN and enforcement of the Bank Secrecy Act. So which way, candidate or President Harris, do you take this person who was in charge of the SEC and by all accounts used every tool in his toolbox to stifle the growth of this industry, and is he cashiered? Thank you for your service, but we're appointing someone else. Or is he moved to a role that is even more, could possibly be even more detrimental to the growth of crypto in the United States? And sort of the closely adjacent question is, it's also sort of DC scuttlebutt, and more than that the Biden administration has outsourced the selection and appointment of the people in these roles, CFTC chair, SEC Democrat nominees, the FTC, I'm throwing a lot of alphabet soup at you, but the regulators of essentially the economy, to Elizabeth Warren and her office. And the second question for a President Harris will be, do you take that back into the White House, because you see what an electoral disaster it was, essentially losing Silicon Valley support for Democrats as a result of your economic policy, or do you keep it where it is? I don't know the answers to those questions, but I think that's what we have to be thinking about.
Man, Washington is complicated. I think we have time for one question. How about right here?
You're asking lawyers about ethical issues.
Well, I'll take a first stab at that. Look, I think there is an inherent autonomy, an inherent self-determination embedded in the American political process where voters can vote on whatever they want. And as an embedded component of that, yes, if you decide you want to vote on one issue, then you absolutely can. It can be crypto, it could be the economy more broadly, it could be wars, it could be anything. But I think there's, to answer the question you didn't ask, is that the wise decision? Oftentimes no, because as we've talked about, these political agents have so much under their purview, and they make their own decisions about what they choose to focus on and what they choose to leave languish, which oftentimes, almost universally, is not consistent with their narrative prior to getting elected.
Really quick, 30 seconds.
I hear the framing that the regulation is bad for the industry, but aren't there groups in the industry that benefit from the regulation? In particular, ICOs are illegal, so crypto VCs, VC in general, is protected against retail investors in terms of deal flow.
I'm happy to take a shot at this. I actually think what's interesting about the dynamic right now is that industry is asking for regulation, not wanton enforcement. So I think what's happening right now is people are frustrated because the law is not clear. You have a different SEC chair come in, you have different people come in to all these regulatory agencies, and they can't know what to expect. It's really dependent on who gets elected, right? The way that you have an effective economy is that you have clear rules of law and precedent set over time. And so when you see a lot of people in crypto talk about the need for legislation, they're saying we need to know the rules. So we need legislation that addresses this industry in particular. So it's a rare occasion where you're seeing people, Democrats are like known for asking for regulation, but Republicans are asking for regulation, right? Because they want clear rules of the road for crypto. And that's the distinction that I would draw here. Not we don't want regulation, it's give us regulation so we know what to expect. Thank you all so much. Appreciate your hanging out for this chat. And thank you to our panelists.